These are devotions for people at a social distance. This morning, my personal devotions took me to the 29th Psalm, and I saw many connections with some of the things that we are dealing with, struggling with in the world today. Psalm 29, the central image of this psalm is the voice of the Lord. In other words, what happens when God speaks. The voice of the Lord is over the waters. The glory of God thunders, the Lord over mighty waters. Now, as you read this psalm, it becomes pretty clear that what the psalmist is actually describing is a great, big, violent storm and saying God speaks through the storm. But let's just live with the imagery that he uses to describe the voice of the Lord. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. The Lord breaks the cedars of Lebanon. He makes Lebanon skip like a calf and Syrian like a young wild ox. The voice of the Lord flashes forth with flames of fire. The voice of the Lord shakes the wilderness. The Lord shakes the wilderness of Kadesh. The voice of the Lord causes the oaks to swirl and strips the forest bare, and all in his temple say glory. Pretty strong imagery. And it's yes, it's the imagery of a powerful storm, but it's much more than that. It's the imagery of a world all of a sudden thrown into frenzy and chaos, and everything seems out of control. And the psalmist affirms that this is what it is like when God speaks. Now, that made me think very much of what we're dealing with in the world today. We are dealing with a great deal of turmoil. It seems like the most I've seen in my lifetime. Others may differ, but it's definitely a chaotic time, a pandemic that has thrown everything into turmoil, that has created lots of economic turmoil that will probably only intensify, and of course, a wave of protests beginning in Minneapolis, spreading throughout the United States and around the world. Protest with all the chaos that brings, and violence and disturbing amount of violence on the part of police that has been seen. The turmoil, the upset, chaos kind of reminds me what is described in this psalm. And the central affirmation of the psalmist, and this is what I want to underline, is he says, this is the voice of the Lord. This, in other words, is what it is like when God speaks. We'd like to think that God always speaks to bring calm and rest, but the voice of the Lord, the word of the Lord, is actually there to stir things up. And I do think we do and must hear the voice of the Lord speaking out of the situation of the pandemic, and the need to make changes in our economy, I think, is absolutely key. And absolutely, we need to be hearing the voice of the Lord in those who are protesting race-based violence against Black people and other racial minorities. The voice of the Lord needs to speak us and convicts us to change. And yes, that causes all kinds of turmoil and chaos. That's sometimes what it's like when God speaks. Now, that's disturbing, and I don't want to leave us just disturbed, because the psalmist doesn't end there. These are the last two verses of the psalm, and I want to leave you with these. The Lord sits enthroned over the flood. The Lord sits enthroned as king forever. Now, the flood is this image that you see in the Old Testament of the Bible. It's basically the primordial flood. You know, that flood at the beginning of the book of Genesis. You know, the world was formless and void, and darkness covered the face of the deep. That formless void, that chaos, is the flood that's being referred to here. And so the psalmist ends by affirming that God ultimately does rule over the chaos, rule over the flood. When the world is in turmoil, God is still ruler. So there's that. peace of comfort, even in tumultuous times. And then the final verse, may the Lord give strength to his people. May the Lord bless his people with peace, is our prayer. These are tumultuous times. May God give you peace. May the God give us peace. May God give us all strength for such times, obviously. And the peace that is needed, and this is key, is not simply a calming over of the troubled waters. Peace is about what happens when a more just society is created. To just stop the protests against, the Black Lives Matter protests is not peace. It is when we begin to make changes in our whole approach to racial justice, among other crying justice issues today. That's when real peace matters. And the promise is, yes, God can give us strength in the midst of these tumultuous times. And yes, God can and will bless his people with peace. So I'm going to just pray. And I ask you to pray today and continue to pray the final verses of this psalm, the final verse. Lord God, give strength to your people. Lord God, bless your people with peace.